In this final of our lectures, this one should be brief, especially in comparison to the others. We're going to reflect on the representativeness of Congress. And this is, of course, something that students have already studied in some detail, but it's worth revisiting here. As we think about how our representatives and senators represent us and who we are, we need to think about who the representatives and senators are themselves. And the first thing to point out is something that in the American context is taken for granted and for a lot of people just not even really considered, is representatives and senators are nearly exclusively Democrats or Republicans. We have a vanishingly small number of independents. Usually it ranges between 1 and 2. And these independents are only, in some sense, independent in name, because in order to really be part of the process and included, they have to kind of cast their lot in with either the Republicans or the Democrats by joining either party's caucus. And remember, caucuses are those informal groupings of representatives and senators. Of course, the party caucuses are the biggest. There are smaller caucuses around special interests or particular kind of ideological clusters. And the point here is that representatives are one of two choices, essentially. Again, even with independents, whereas many Americans don't consider themselves to be Republicans or Democrats. Although, truth be told, as we look at elections, a lot of people who claim to be independent pretty reliably vote for one party or the other. For now, let's just leave the point at this. In their party affiliations, they leave out a lot of Americans who don't see themselves as one party or the other. And of course, as we've seen, they're also, speaking of representatives and senators, demographically unrepresentative of the population. So here are some demographics. It's a little different way than we've seen it, and this is about the 119th Congress. And the kind of bluish bars represent the general population, and the more close to burgundy, I guess maybe if you're being fancy, and maybe if I'm being right about the color spectrum, aubergine, perhaps. And then the House, which, since we've lent ourselves to fancy color names, I suppose that one would be saffron. As if we look at these in terms of race and ethnicity, the House and the Senate are often quite far off. The House gets much closer with African Americans than with whites and Latinos in terms of matching the general population. But the point of this is, however we look at it, broadly speaking, the House and the Senate are quite unrepresentative in that sense. And so what this means, and what we haven't really talked about to this point, and that's one of the reasons we're covering it now, is the makeup demographically of Congress means descriptive representation is not really possible. And descriptive representation, you might have already kind of puzzled this out logically, means we have representatives and senators who look like and otherwise possess the characteristics of the people they represent. And the descriptions of the representatives and the voters would be the same. We can't have that. And for a lot of people, it's not necessary. And the reason for this is, and again, it depends on who you talk to. Identity politics is a powerful force in the United States. But there is another way of talking about representation, and that is substantive representation. It's the idea that even if your representative or senator is different from you, they are still able to understand your interests and advocate for those interests as your representative. And for people who are in support of this idea of representation, this works and it's unproblematic. For people more inclined towards identity politics, this is, for them, kind of akin to what we saw with the American colonists. They wanted direct representation, meaning they wanted to vote for the people who would represent them, whereas since they didn't have that, the British Parliament argued that that was okay because they had virtual representation. Now, of course, in the United States, even for people who are more inclined towards identity politics, they still get to vote for their representatives. Their representatives just may not look like them. So I don't want you to conflate descriptive and substantive representation differences with the earlier direct representation versus virtual representation. Just kind of putting that out there so we can kind of compare those two ideas. Now, to finish out this section, you need to read and take some notes over a brief section in the text, and that is, why aren't there more women in Congress? Because as you've seen, and this really just focuses on race and ethnicity, not really, it quite literally focuses only on race and ethnicity. We saw other ways in which Congress was not representative. And one of the issues there is in terms of gender. So I would like you to read and take some notes over this brief section of the text. It's all on page 313 in the Chapter 11 handout that you've had for some time. And from this, we're going to shift to what influences members' decisions. Okay? And this is important for understanding the type of representation we get as constituents. Okay? So this is a related topic. And we're going to kind of look at a laundry list of potential influences. There we go. Put that up there. Some of these we've already seen. Traditional leader pressure. Not just speaker and majority leader, but especially those whips that are there to try to make sure that their party's members are supporting the bills that the party is trying to move through the chambers of Congress. Presidential influence is also something that can be important. In lots of cases, political scientists refer to the president as the chief legislator, which is kind of jarring to our understanding of things because we've been learning about separation of powers and checks and balances. The president is the chief executive. The executive branch and the legislative branch are different, with different prerogatives and different powers, different interests. But presidents are, in a sense, a chief legislator. They have their bully pulpit. They have their policy agenda. We can see that playing out with lots of cases. One early in Trump's second term, seeking a specific budget bill to allow the president to focus on his spending priorities and give him more leeway in how appropriations from Congress are spent. And because presidents have the bully pulpit, they can get that message out there. Remember, when we talk about presidents, one of their major powers is agenda setting through the bully pulpit. And that agenda is largely legislative. There's also ideology and party. And these are not always the same thing, but as Congress has become more polarized between the parties have become more ideologically cohesive. And we can see that in these graphs, one for the Senate and one for the House. And this shows from the 92nd through the 117th Congress trends in increasing move towards right, more conservative, left, liberal ideologies. And as this graph is labeled, there has been more move to the right by Republicans than there has been move to the left by Democrats, although you can see this is somewhat more pronounced in the House. You guys are just going to love my always pausing things to monkey around with formats. So, we're not going to do that in this case. there you guys can see how the sausage gets made. We'll get back to this. And another part of this story is that as we have more safe seats, especially in the House, we have more extreme representatives. And we'll kind of see one of the reasons for that in just a bit. In terms of party influence, one of the major sources in campaign finance leverage. Speakers, people who want to be Speaker of the House, Senate Majority Leaders, or if they switch to being the Minority Leader, leaders have their own political action committees, which we have not learned a lot about yet, but we will when we look at elections. But for now, political action committees are money-raising and distributing machines. And one of the things that party leaders can do is use that offer of money or threat of withholding money to encourage representatives and senators to behave the way the leaders want them to, which is meant to ensure party loyalty and is at least somewhat effective. Here, and this is a bit more arcane, the issue of information asymmetry. And to use the far too cliched phrase, knowledge is power, it often really is. And leaders knowing more about bills, especially in this era of unorthodox legislating, where we have things like omnibus bills, which are so massive that nobody can have read them before they're voted on, although there are some superhuman members of Congress that do attempt this, and they often end up voting against more bills as a result. But for the most part, because of unorthodox lawmaking, omnibus bills, negotiation between leaders between the houses, sometimes bypassing committees, leaders often know far more than rank-and-file representatives. That would be in the House and Senate. Here, representative is just a blanket term for us in this sense. They know more. And so sometimes they are able to use that to exploit their advantage to get members to vote the way they want, support the legislation without fully knowing what's in it. The influence of ideology and party is not universal. There are some issues where it is stronger than others. So in terms of economic legislation, which, things like tax and spend, trade policy, perhaps, but also social spending, which you'll sometimes see, and if you were reading this in your textbook, you would see this referred to as welfare spending, but social spending, which can be what we think of as welfare assistance to low-income people, but also things like Medicare and Social Security for the elderly. On those issues, ideology and party exert the most consistent, strong influence. And of course, I forgot that I put that in there, but yes, do equate social spending with welfare. They're often used interchangeably, even if it's not entirely accurate. Another area of influence is constituents, and they're coming later in this list, but constituents do matter. Even at my most cynical moments, constituents still have influence over what representatives do. Obviously, this is something that comes into play during elections, and you might be asking, well, what about those safe seats? If the seats are so safe, are representatives really answerable to their constituents? And of course, safe seats, again, that refers primarily to the House, although very red, very blue states, a lot of times we can think of those as pretty safe seats as well for senators. The reason that elections still matter, even in an era of safe seats, is the threat of getting primaried. With ideological polarization in the parties, we see that also reflected in constituents. Because even though there are a lot of independents, there are a lot of very dedicated partisans in the voting public. And they are the people who are most likely to participate in primary elections, where we determine who will be on the ballot at the general election. So today's representatives have to worry maybe not so much about who they're going to face in the general election, but what more extreme candidate will they face in the primary who may defeat them. So elections still matter. But it's also not just at elections. So this bar graph shows us various ways of constituents trying to influence representatives. And we can see that some matter more than others. Form email messages that you may receive from an interest group, where you just kind of input your information about who you are and who your representative is, and then that is sent off through the electronic ether to land in an inbox at your representative's office. Those don't have much impact. So you have the two shaded bars here, light blue, dark blue. Light blue means some influence, a weaker influence. Dark blue would be strong influence. Those form email messages are not what economists would call a costly signal. So representatives don't infer from receiving a lot of form email messages that their constituents are really, really fired up about an issue. However, somebody going out of their way to visit their representative in person, or even maybe show up at one of their offices back home in their state or district to talk to office staff, those are much more impactful. And I realize for a lot of you the idea, well, how am I going to get FaceTime with my representative or senator? You're probably not. But even things like individualized email messages, I'm actually surprised those are more influential than individualized postage letters that have to be either typed or handwritten, put in an envelope, paid postage, dropped off at a mailbox, or taken to a post office. I mean, these are more costly signals. The constituents that choose to communicate with their representatives in this fashion, they are committed. They are sending costly signals, and so we can see those do tend to be more influential. Where constituent influence is weaker is when constituents don't know what's going on. And most members of the American public, most of the time, don't know what's going on. They have other things going on in their lives. It doesn't mean they're not intelligent and they can't figure it out. But for the most part, and we can kind of see this as a good sign, things run well enough in the country most of the time that most of the people go about their day-to-day lives not caring that much about legislation and policy. When that is the case and constituents aren't aware of the legislation or don't know about it, they're not as influential. That's also that issue of information asymmetry coming back again. And so when constituents are uninformed, members of the House and Senate have more leeway to vote the way they would want to. And we talked a bit about interest groups and those form emails. Interest groups are a powerful influence. We mostly think about them in terms of lobbyists. These are the people who work for interest groups and meet with congressional staffers, including office staff for representatives and senators, to try to persuade them to vote the way the interest group wants, or maybe to propose legislation or alter legislation in line with what the interest group wants. We also associate interest groups with money, and they have it, and they will use it to support or oppose representatives, and that is a powerful source of influence. So are endorsements, and endorsements are really going to target people with special interests, or specific interests. And in some cases, endorsements are pitched by organizations that are focused on what, for some voters, are their key issue. As we'll see when we get to elections, we have groups of voters called single-issue voters, where there is one issue they care about more than all the rest, and they will make their voting decisions, if not entirely, largely based on a candidate's stand on those issues. So for those reasons, an endorsement from the National Rifle Association can be very important for single-issue voters opposed to gun control. An endorsement from the Planned Parenthood Action Fund for someone who cares most about the issue of abortion and access to abortion, that can be incredibly powerful, and representatives are sensitive to getting those endorsements. You could also see the same thing on the pro-life side for that. And this causes critics to worry. The power of lobbyists, the power of money. I think they're less concerned generally about the power of endorsements, but critics worry that money has come to dominate politics, especially interest group money. This also raises concerns of hyperpluralism, which it's been a while since we talked about this, but remember, the idea is that there are so many powerful competing interests that it really becomes hard for Congress to legislate, just because there are so many, countervailing pressures on what policies to craft and support. Now, that was kind of our litany of influences. To help us understand how much and which of those influences will matter depends a bit on the type of representative we have. So we have some different types. One category of representatives are what have been referred to for a long time as delegates. Okay? And they view themselves as people who are supposed to quite directly represent the interests of their constituents. They want to know what their constituents think, and then they will base their decisions, crafting legislation, supporting legislation, based on information they get from their constituents. Trustees, on the other hand, see themselves as people who have been entrusted by their constituents to use their own best judgment in terms of what legislation to support. And for them, even if their constituents seem to disagree with them on a particular issue or piece of legislation, because they view themselves as trustees, they rely more on their own judgment than on the current opinions and positions of their constituents. The third type are partisans. And partisans, they toe the party line. What does the party want? That is what we will do. And then there are politicos. And this is, I think, what the British would call kind of a bodge on this taxonomy of representatives. Politicos are, for people who rely on this typology and see a lot of value in it, they are typical. And the reason I'm calling this a bodge is, say, well, look, they're just a blend of the other three. Right? They're delegates in the sense that they care about what their constituents want, at least some of the time. They're trustees in the sense that sometimes they use their own judgment, independent from thoughts of what the constituents would like. And then sometimes they care about the party, but hey, if the constituents back home are really fired up about an issue and constituents are not in line with the representative's party, then we side with the constituents instead of the party. I say that's a bodge because, well, I mean, if they're a blend of all three, then really, why do we talk about different types when we essentially have most representatives consider constituents their own judgment and what their parties want and kind of weigh those up decision by decision? But anyway, you need to learn about this because you will possibly see these terms on important tests that you're going to take. But my personal view, and I'm somebody as a political scientist who finds value in some taxonomies, I think this one is of limited utility, but you do need to be familiar with it, so we've covered it in your notes. This brings us to our parting thoughts. Congress and U.S. democracy, broadly speaking. Congress is elitist. It's the first final thought. And that is true, even though now representatives in both chambers, both houses, are popularly elected as a result of the 17th Amendment that took the power of selecting senators away from state legislatures and put it directly in the hands of voters. And it's elite. I mean, if we look at, just take one of our demographic factors, occupations, the fact that a disproportionate number of representatives are lawyers with advanced degrees. I mean, they're certainly elitist in that sense, but also others. However, Congress is also influenced by constituents and interest groups. So it's not just purely, we have, that federalist idea of elites, people who would be, dispassionate, logical decision makers who would weigh the merits of legislation and either support it or oppose it based on those merits, largely exercising their own judgment. They are elitist, but they don't fit that federal mold, partly because they are popularly elected and they are influenced not just by their own judgment, but by constituents and interest groups. And so this leaves us a question. I mean, what model of democracy do we now have in the United States? Is it elitism? Is it pluralism? Or hyperpluralism? Now, we just talked about elitism and hyperpluralism, so I won't reiterate all of those now, but pluralism is in the middle, and it's just the idea that there are openings in the policymaking process for lots of different people to be able to have input, constituents and interest groups. And if you're thinking about this and your opinion of interest groups is low, I'm not saying you're wrong, but do remember that a lot of interest groups are made up of large numbers of individuals who give small amounts of money to that interest group. So they're not always, I don't want you to always think of interest groups as tools of, say, big business or big labor. And so if we think about them that way, maybe we have pluralism. It's that middle ground between an elite-run show and a hyper-pluralist muddle where there are too many voices for anybody to understand what Congress should do. Where we actually are in terms of those three models is up for debate and something that you may be asked to decide for yourself at some point. That's not, for me, like a vague hint about what might be coming on an essay test in this class, but it could come up on another test that you will see. Who knows? All right, but that's where we're going to leave off.